Well, Stephen Carroll and Doug Herbert were both listening in to that with me. Stephen, it's interesting. Not a lot that he said there that we didn't already know from this morning.
We had these series of reports over the past couple of days outlining what we expect to be the British position when they present this text to the European Union. Just as Boris Johnson was starting to speak there, we did have a statement from the European Commission saying that when they get the text, implying they don't have it yet, that they will examine it objectively and in light of their well-known criteria. I don't know if we got so much detail that they'll have to chew over until they get the details of what he is in that text of a proposal. But the main principles were that he said there will be no checks at or near the border in Ireland. That's the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. That they will respect the peace process and the Good Friday Agreement. That there will be this issue of what he called renewable democratic consent by the Northern Irish Executive. So a role for the Stormont Assembly in deciding Northern Ireland's future, because it will, it appears anyway from the little detail we have in the speech, line up with this reports we've had to say that there's going to be two kinds of borders under the plan. One would be a customs border at or apparently not near the physical border, where customs checks would have to be carried out as goods travel from Ireland into Northern Ireland or vice versa, and then that there would be a regulatory alignment border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom as well, where there would be regulatory checks as Northern Ireland would remain within the EU's rules over things like farming issues, this famous SPS, animal health zone, one of the most important all-island businesses. He said in his speech that they would protect existing regulatory alignments for farmers and businesses. We don't know how far he's talking about alignment on those rules and exactly what areas, because there's a lot more to it than just farming. But the point being, they do still intend to leave the customs unions. There would have to be customs checks on the island of Ireland, but regulatory checks between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK.
And this is where a lot of people, without even seeing already the details of this deal, are already crying foul. They already are saying that this is a non-starter. And why? Because of what Stephen was just explaining. Essentially, under Britain, they're saying this is essentially a sabotage of the Good Friday Agreement in the sense of one of the things that reassured Europe perhaps under Theresa May's withdrawal agreement was this idea of having an Irish backstop, which would ensure there would be no hard border returned to the island of Ireland between the Republic of Ireland and between Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland obviously being a part right now of Britain. Britain right now for the time being part of the EU, but when Brexit Day comes, presumably they would be leaving. Republic of Ireland is a member of the EU and will remain a member of the EU, creating this whole problem. The Good Friday Agreement and the fact that goods have been able to flow unchecked freely across that border has created a lot of not just prosperity, but a sense of stability for the communities on both sides of that border for the past 5, 10, 15, 20 years since that agreement. And anything that is seen as hindering or returning to the way things were before that Good Friday Agreement is seen as potentially not just destabilizing, but really touching off a lot of conflict in these communities. This is what's interesting. The reason some are saying that this, Boris Johnson's plan, could amount to a breach of Britain's own domestic laws is that in 2018, under Britain's own withdrawal act, basically there was a detailed clause that banned, and this is really was in quotes, border arrangements between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland that would feature what's called physical infrastructure. Now, physical infrastructure is fancy language for checks and border controls that did not exist before exit day, before Brexit Day. Essentially, cutting through all the fine print of this plan, which we have not read yet in its details, what seems to be the case and has not been denied by Boris Johnson or anyone right now in the Conservative Party that does presumably know this plan. They do not deny that there would continue to be some checks or border controls, but they don't believe that they would be of a nature to cause the type of instability along that border that I was talking about. They said that there would be enough, so to speak, exemptions, or at least, as what Stephen was talking about, continued regulatory alignment, as they call it, between Northern Ireland and the EU for a 4-year period until 2025 to essentially prevent any sort of hard border being reestablished. Critics are going to look at it. Skeptics are going to look at it. A lot of people on the European mainland are going to be looking at it, but especially people in the Republic of Ireland themselves, including the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister. They're already extremely skeptical that this plan is workable as it has been presented by the reports and in its broad outlines. They see a hard border or contours of a hard border being reestablished. And for them, that is an absolute non-starter.
Right. Well, that was going to be my next question is what has Ireland had to say so far, given what we know so far?
Well, the Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Simon Coveney, spoke about this a little bit earlier, and he said that it was, according to the reports anyway, likely not good news. They said they will assess the detailed proposal when they get it, and it goes to the EU first. It doesn't go straight to the governments of other countries. It has to go through Task Force 50, the negotiation team within the EU. He said that he wouldn't be too encouraged by the reports, and if there are proposals for custom checks, he doesn't think that's going to be the basis for any agreement. That's the Irish Foreign Minister's comments this morning before that speech started. It's worth reminding ourselves what the EU says its red lines are in these negotiations. They want a fully open border. They want to preserve the north-south cooperation on the island of Ireland, preserve the all-island economy, the integrity of the single market, and that's where the regulatory rules come in. You can't have the integrity of the single market preserved if there aren't the required standards maintained north and south of that border. And whatever solution that the British government proposes, it must be legally operable. That means that they can put it into a text they think they can work and implement. And that's the sort of detail they're going to be looking for later on. We are expecting to have the EU examine this, as they promised to do, in an objective fashion, to look at it. And what we'll be looking for is what kind of reaction we get from the European Union later on. Will they be making murmurings about, oh, well, there's progress to be made, perhaps, things to be looked at, or will they dismiss it out of hand?
Well, it's interesting because Boris Johnson himself said he hoped that Brussels would find room to compromise to secure a deal. Is there any chance of that happening?
But this has been Boris Johnson's sort of signature political strategy until now. This very sort of bodacious, if you will, optimism, repeatedly asserting that, he sees a prosperous, great future for Britain, that anyone who sort of opposes even looking at this plan, they are the ones who are the obstructionists, the opposition, those on the EU continent. And I don't think that this is a coincidence. I think that the strategy, obviously he's not going to explicitly state it, and the reason that a lot of people aren't taking this offer seriously is at the end of the day, Boris Johnson isn't seriously interested in a deal. There's no illusion or delusion, if you will, among many members of the Conservative Party, even if they're not going to publicly come out and say this, that this is a workable deal. What this is more about is exactly what Boris Johnson was saying before. It's about this ironclad adherence to this political pledge, this get Brexit done, leave, do or die on October 31st, without really delving into the fine print. A lot of the skeptics will say Boris Johnson is not interested in looking at the fine print of a backstop deal or how to overhaul it or how to make it workable. What he wants to do is deliver on Brexit come what may. And, the Parliament has basically tried to forestall the idea of a no deal, right? They actually passed a law saying that they cannot just crash out, that Boris Johnson would be legally obligated to seek an extension if by October 19th, 2 days after the European Council, which is coming up, there was still no deal to be had. We're already seeing defiance there on Boris Johnson's part, hinting that there are already reports that he might actually suspend Parliament again, prorogue Parliament perhaps next week again. Can he do that? Perhaps. And at the same time, signals emerging that he is perhaps determined to defy the will of Parliament on this issue. That is, not obey that legal obligation under the parliamentary law to seek an extension of Brexit. He at one point had said he'd rather be dead in a ditch than go back to Brussels and say we need more time. So his overarching political message, just to reiterate, is get out of the European Union on October 31st, and this is why that is at the end of the day what he is determined to do. And a lot of people on the European continent say it's not a serious offer. He's not really engaged in the real negotiations or the details of the negotiations, or whether or not what the actual outcome will be. What he is more preoccupied with right now is getting out and then finding ways to shift the blame to those for failure to reach a deal, which he still said a few minutes ago he's determined to have. He wants to have a deal, but let there be no illusions. If there is no deal, he is ready and prepared to do a no deal. And he got applause from a lot of people. Are we ready for that? And a lot of people in that conference hall clapped. So that is really the political strategy, the political maneuvering right now, posturing, if you will. And it's a message that a lot of the Conservatives and the vast majority, if not almost all of the Brexit voters right now will endorse.
It's also worth remembering the timetable that's involved here. To renegotiate an international treaty, which is what the withdrawal agreement was, getting it done the first time around took a long time, and the time is very, very short. That European Council meeting, October 17th, October 18th, even if this was a workable solution that the European Union could find a way to compromise around, it would involve a greater with rewriting of the withdrawal agreement than there is perhaps physically time to do between now and the end of October, because it would have to be drafted, agreed, make sure that it is legally operable, this guarantee the European Commission has insisted on. Anything beyond a surgical change to the withdrawal agreement could take an enormous amount of time, even if there was political agreement around it. So the fact that this plan seems to be a more than a simple change. The one that had been floated around previously is whether or not, for example, the UK would ask for the backstop instead of keeping the entire United Kingdom in the customs union, that instead it would keep just Northern Ireland, something that the European Union had originally proposed but Theresa May had disagreed with. That change, if you listen to people who are knocking around EU corridors for a long time, they say that that could potentially be done in time. Anything more major than that, there's a very big question mark over whether it's even possible to change it in time.
France